So let us bring in Washington Post reporter Callum Borchers. He joins us now from Washington. Callum, thanks for joining us. First off, this is a move that has been speculated about for some time now. How do you see things unfolding from here?
Well, I see it as being very consistent with what the president talked about on the campaign trail. Remember, he really warmed up to coal miners, talked about how he was clearly going to put the focus more on job creation and think less about what the consequences might be for the environment. I think in the big picture, this change, whether the president actually goes through and finalizes it, or even if he has sort of a last-second change of heart, the pattern that we've seen in the early presidency so far is definitely a deprioritization of environmental regulations. You saw the proposal to cut the budget of the EPA by roughly a third. So very clearly, we see this as part of a trend for the new president.
Callum, there is no way to actually police whether or not countries will abide by the agreements that have been made through the Paris Accords. The United States is the second biggest emitter of carbon dioxide gases after China in the world. So explain, I guess, to how the White House is going to make the case for making these regulations less burdensome for companies when apparently we're already the ones that the United States is spewing toxic chemicals into the air.
Well, the case is that, look, the goal, right, for the United States was to cut greenhouse gas emissions by about a quarter by 2025 relative to 2005 levels, if you can keep all those numbers straight. And the argument from the White House is that by doing that, you are putting unnecessary burdens on American businesses. It could be automakers as far as what cars are emitting, and it could be energy producers, especially, again, the domestic energy that might come from coals, for instance. And so what the president is going to say is, look, I care about the planet. He has described himself as being kind of an environmentalist, but clearly saying, I care more about the American worker. And he's also going to sort of cast it in political terms, that this was an agreement struck by so-called globalists, which is kind of a dirty word in the Trump administration. He is an economic nationalist and proud of it. This is very consistent with the Steve Bannon vision of the world as well.
So yesterday, during the White House press briefing, Sean Spicer was asked directly about the president's beliefs about climate change in general. Let's listen to the exchange and then we'll talk about it.
Can you say whether or not the president believes that human activity is contributing to the warming of the climate?
Honestly, I haven't asked him.
Okay.
I can get back to you.
All right, so he said that he hadn't asked him yet. What do you make of that response? Do you buy that?
It might be true, but it is still sort of a surprising statement when you think about what a very basic question that might be, and the fact that the scientific consensus on that matter is overwhelming that humans do indeed contribute to climate change. I'm reminded, for example, of the big brouhaha that some folks had when the New York Times hired a new conservative columnist away from the Wall Street Journal, right? And the complaint was, look, this guy is supposedly a climate denier, and in fact, even this conservative columnist was saying, yes, humans do contribute to climate change. The thing we have to worry about or question is projections about future climate change. So if you're in a position where you're wondering whether the president even acknowledges the impact that humans have on the changing climate, that would be very far out of the mainstream.
All right, Callum, we're also following a number of developments surrounding the Russia investigation. Which of Sean Spicer's answers stood out to you yesterday regarding Russia? It was a briefing that you called one for the ages.
It was. I mean, the first standout moment to me was when he was asked right off the top by our Philip Rucker about whether and when the president found out that Jared Kushner had requested a setup of a private, back channel to communicate with the Kremlin. And Spicer sort of stopped him there and said, I can't really answer that question because it assumes that that conversation actually took place. And I think that was sort of a moment to step back and say, well, what are you talking about? Because since we reported on that conversation on Friday, the White House had not really made any attempt to shoot it down. And this is a White House that cries fake news left and right seemingly every day. And their argument for 3 days over the long weekend wasn't that the report was false. The argument was that there was nothing wrong with what Jared Kushner did, that back channels are common, that they're appropriate, that they're even good. And then what changed, of course, was that on Monday, Fox News reported, citing citing a single unnamed source on a report that didn't even carry a byline, that the conversation actually did not take place. And Trump seemed to endorse that new argument by retweeting a link to it on the day, earlier in the day on Tuesday. And so I think that sort of put Spicer in a corner where he couldn't really stick to the message the White House had been projecting for 3 days. He sort of had to, acknowledge what the president had done earlier in the day. And this is a pattern that we see over and over again of the president kind of deviating from the coherent message that his team has put together.
Speaking of coherent messages, Callum, you wrote about the president's tweet, the tweet heard around the world, where he talked about Kofifi, and Vlad and I have been debating exactly how to pronounce that. But you wrote about this, and you said that the important thing is not the tweet. The important thing is the tweet after the tweet. If we needed any more evidence that President Trump loves to distract journalists and voters, we have the perfect exhibit right here. Talk about that, the tweet after the tweet. What did you mean by that?
I'm going with Kofefe, by the way.
That's what I've been saying, Callum. I agree. You and I are on the same page.
Yeah, it sounds more sophisticated.
Yes.
Which is why I'm not going with it, but go ahead.
But my point is, look, I think that very clearly this was just a typo. I'm assuming he was manning to type about negative press coverage and somehow had a few stray thumb taps in there. Deletes the tweet, which we've seen him do before when he misspells a word. So that was not unusual. But what was striking to me was the way that the hashtag Kofefe became like this overnight sensation. And so, in classic opportunistic fashion, Trump really embraced the moment. And so it was the follow-up tweet saying, hey, let's try to figure out what the true meaning of Kofefe is and enjoy. I mean, he was explicitly sending reporters and voters on kind of this wild goose chase to divine the real significance of what was probably just a typo. And to some degree it worked. I mean, we're talking about it now. It came up on the cable news morning shows this morning. It was the lead item in the Politico playbook. And so it's not that it was a positive story for the president. I mean, the analysis has largely been unfavorable in the sense that, oh, this shows yet again that he's addicted to Twitter, he's undisciplined, etc. But every moment that we spend talking about this is a moment that we're not talking about Russia, or we're not talking about the resignation of his White House communications director, or we're not talking about why on earth he would want to try to pick a fight on Twitter with Germany. What it does is it doesn't sort of stop negative press coverage, but it does sort of move it onto a pretty harmless subject.
Yeah, I was surprised at how this took off like wildfire, and I wondered if people were just looking for something sort of lighthearted.
It was overnight, and so people, Washington insiders, Beltway types, journalists who are insomniacs were seeing that and, sort of retweeting it, and it became a thing. But you're right, Callum, it's a good point to make, which is that there are much more important things that are affecting this presidency and this country, and the focus should clearly be on that.
Yeah. Callum Borchers of the Washington Post, thank you so much, Callum.
Glad to be with you.